Hey, my name is Kirk Wallace. I'm a freelance illustrator. I'm going to walk you through my process of how I created this goofy little character in his new mini truck that was inspired by a trip to Amsterdam. I am working on a Wacom Cintiq Pro, and I'll be working in Photoshop and Illustrator. The goal of this video is basically just to kind of be a broad overview of my process, kind of how I go from gathering references to sketching and then bringing that sketch into Illustrator, making all my shapes and colors, and then some texturing in Photoshop. I'll try to slow down at certain parts to give some tips, but with that said, if you have any questions about my process specifically, feel free to leave comments and ask questions. Let's get started, and you can kind of sit back and relax and enjoy. All right. So the story for this was just, I've always loved these little cars whenever I go to Europe, and just recently I was in Amsterdam for a week and saw so many of these goofy little triangle cars, and it reminded me of how much I also love these like mini trucks, and just wanted to draw that. I wanted to make something simple for this project, kind of make the car itself a bit of a character. So I start really simply with just drawing cars in general, just because I don't draw super often regularly. So I just need to figure out what a car looks like. You can figure out tires, do I want little tires, big windshield, small. How do I want to make a character out of this basic shape and kind of instill life into it? So, I probably started getting serious down around here when I started realizing I want to have a person in the car, like patting the door. Went to here, started feeling pretty good about it. Liked the idea of cardboard boxes being in the back, because that kind of helps show how small the truck is, because usually we don't see huge cardboard boxes. And the fact that they're sort of weighing down the truck helps show like that it's sort of a little tiny car. Then when I get a decent sketch, I'm still in Photoshop at this point, and I'll just really do a rough color pass just to see what's working, how I want to do the lighting, the shadows, and basic colors. And then I will take that sketch usually and bring it into Illustrator, where I will trace out all of my shapes and group things so that I can move them around easily. And then bring in that same color palette, color it in, usually starting with an outline. And then for me, I always like to remove the outline and focus just on shadows and stuff to help show the contour of shapes. And then at the end, we'll bring it back into Photoshop and do a little bit of texturing process. So next up, let's get into sketching, where we will get lost for probably 20 minutes trying to figure out what it's gonna look like. So I'm starting really basic shapes and forms here, nothing crazy. I've said it a few times, but my sketching isn't my strongest suit. So I'm just trying to figure out proportions and really just exploring and learning. And it doesn't take me a ton of time to get somewhere where I feel like I can kind of progress to the next layer. So often what I'll do is I'll lower that opacity to that layer and then build a new one on top. So I'm obviously using my big Wacom Cintiq Pro here, which has a ton of real estate to draw on, and helps me get better at drawing big. I'm so used to doodling tiny in a little notebook that the Cintiq lets me sort of spread my wings and like draw a little bit bigger from the shoulder, which is something that we should all be doing as illustrators. I'm also using keyboard shortcuts over in my left hand, and then I'm also zooming in and out and rotating with the pen buttons on the stylus itself. I'm really just trying to get myself far enough that I can get into Adobe Illustrator, which is really where I feel the most comfortable. I'll block in basic values just to get like my blacks that I know are going to be dark, and white and just a mid-tone. Really just helped me sort of break up the piece. And so now coloring, what I'll do, this is still in Photoshop, I just run through with a really simple color palette. I get 3 or 4 colors, maybe a shade up, a tint down, or rather a tint down and a shade up. I don't know if I said that right either way. So here I'm using the third button on the stylus to color pick. So over the top right, you can see like a little bit of a color palette that I'm just holding down the button to basically push the Alt button in Photoshop just to color pick, grab a new color, and keep moving. Again, this is not a scientific or really in-depth process. I'm just trying to lay in basic color. And now Illustrator, which is my personal kind of playground. So I bring the initial sketch in without color. Like I said, I'll reference that color later, but I bring in the sketch and I just trace it with the pen tool with a black outline and no fill. And you can see at this point, this is where I start playing around a lot too. Like I had this sort of bucket hat beanie on the character, and then I decided to ditch that and go with hair. So drawing like big, crispy vector graphics on a Wacom stylus is one of the most satisfying things, just because it's 4K screen and just like you could really zoom in and get super colorful with it. Rearranging my shapes, I don't deal much with layers, but what I do deal with is cutting and pasting the shapes in front and in back. So that's where it comes to organizing. Once I've outlined all of my shapes, I will give them a white fill just so that I can know what's in front and what's in back. And just like cut pieces of paper, I'm basically just grouping things that I know I'm going to be selecting often, like this whole box maybe. And then I cut it with Command X, and then I select the shape that I want to put it in front or in back of. And I do either Command F for paste in front or Command B for paste in back. And I'm just moving things in front and back so that it starts making sense in its sort of hierarchy or order. And then for details, I'm always finding room for shadows and play and stuff like that. Now color. I bring in that color sample that I did in Photoshop, but again, I'm still in Illustrator now, and I will just use the ink dropper and grab color and plop it in. I also start by keeping that black outline on the artwork, which I will typically get rid of later. Here's another instance where you can see that I got rid of the hat. I decided to go with the hair. It just felt better, mostly because I didn't want to have another color for the hat. Like I'm always trying to limit my colors as much as I can. So I'm sort of improvising and just making this little hair shape, and then I'll probably cut it and then paste it on top of the head just to get it away from the truck and where it's supposed to actually be. So like I said, I've got this outline that was from the earlier process, and then I just go through and I click on each shape and I remove that outline, and I start building in more shadows and more details to help separate any of the shapes that are struggling without that outline. That outline is a really great way to create separation between all the art, but to me, I like my art without a ton of outline, so I prefer the challenge of using some shadows and highlights and stuff to separate them. So usually by this point, I'm basically, I've got most of my colors figured out, most of my general composition is figured out, and now I just get to play with fun shadows. Another fun thing is I've got like 4 macro keys, or maybe even 8, 4 on each side of the tablet itself, so I'm able to keep one hand on the back of the tablet and have a lot of my Pathfinder tools in Illustrator like hotkeyed to that. So basically anytime I need to do like an intersection or divide or whatever those different Pathfinder things that you can see I'm doing here, I often just have my hand on the tablet itself just clicking one of the 4 buttons on the back, which is new and super cool. And now this is maybe a little bit of a backward process, but it's one of my favorites. Is we had all that line work that we did in Illustrator, but I want them to have more of a tooth and grit to it, like a texture. So what I do now is I bring the artwork into Photoshop, and I use smart objects to pop back in and out of Illustrator. So I'm bouncing between Illustrator and Photoshop. And I'm just lowering the opacity of any of the outline work that was done in Illustrator and basically tracing over it with a brush in Photoshop. Drawing on this matte screen with the pen is extremely satisfying too, with sort of a toothy brush. And with that same sort of process again in Photoshop now as my final step, just bringing in some basic brushes, a little bit of clipping masks and layer masks, nothing super intricate at all. You could use the lasso tool here really well if you needed or if you preferred, but I tend to just brush in some basic textures just to give the whole thing a little bit more of a, organic feel, something that we all are striving for in our digital artwork. And I'm again just like bouncing into, if I double click on the thumbnail of the vector smart object in Photoshop, it'll put me into Illustrator where I can make edits to that vector file, and then if I save it and bounce back into Photoshop, it'll update that. So I'm sort of bouncing back and forth often, deleting the lines in Illustrator, replacing them in Photoshop, and that's what I'm doing here. And sort of toward the end, I just add a little bit more of like scanned paper texture and some noise and grain and stuff like that, and we basically end up with the final result that we'll see in a few seconds. I'm sure there's plenty of opportunity for questions, so feel free to leave anything in the comments. Happy to answer everything. And now here we have our goofy little sketches and the final little car. Thanks for watching.